Professor Marcus Thompson adjusted his reading glasses as he carefully examined the sepia-toned photograph that had arrived at the Chicago Historical Society that morning. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of his office, casting shifting shadows across his mahogany desk, where dozens of historical photographs lay waiting for cataloging. The 1901 family portrait appeared unremarkable at first glance. A typical Victorian-era family of four, posed formally in their Sunday finest, their faces bearing the serious expressions common to photography of that era. The father, stern-faced, with a thick mustache and deep-set eyes, stood behind his seated wife with the rigid posture expected of a man of his apparent social standing. His dark suit was well-tailored, suggesting prosperity, while his hand rested on his wife's shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of familial unity. The woman in the center wore a high-collared dark dress typical of 1901 fashion, her hair pulled back in the elaborate style popular among Chicago's middle class. Her expression appeared serene, almost resigned, though there was something in her. Eyes that Marcus couldn't quite identify, a hollowness that seemed at odds with the formal family setting. Two young children flanked their mother's chair, boy and girl no older than 8 and 10, dressed in their finest clothes with the rigid posture that photographers of the era demanded. Their faces bore the solemn expressions typical of children forced to remain still for the long exposure times required by early cameras. Yet something about their positioning seemed deliberately protective of their mother. Another donation from the estate sale, his assistant Jenny had mentioned earlier that morning, placing the photograph among dozens of similar family portraits from the turn of the century. Marcus had been cataloging historical photographs for over 15 years, and this one seemed destined for the archives like countless others, a silent witness to lives long forgotten, faces that would soon disappear into the vast collection of Chicago's documented past. As Marcus began entering the photograph's details into the database, something caught his attention. The lighting in his office was particularly bright that afternoon, and when he leaned closer to examine the woman's face for dating purposes, he noticed something unusual about the shadows around her high Victorian collar. The fabric seemed to sit strangely against her neck, bunching in ways that suggested it might be concealing something beneath. Marcus positioned his professional magnifying glass over the photograph, adjusting the angle of his desk lamp to eliminate any glare that might obscure important details. The high Victorian collar, which he had initially assumed was merely fashionable for the period, now drew his attention for entirely different reasons. The fabric appeared deliberately positioned, almost strategically arranged to cover as much of the woman's neck as possible, while still maintaining the appearance of contemporary style. As he adjusted the angle of the light source, the shadows shifted dramatically, revealing what appeared to be faint discoloration beneath the fabric's edge. The marks were subtle, barely visible to the naked eye, but under magnification and proper lighting, they became unmistakably present. These weren't the random stains or age spots that commonly appeared on photographs from this era. They were too uniform, too deliberately placed along the woman's throat area. "This can't be right," Marcus whispered to himself, his breath fogging the magnifying glass slightly. He cleaned the lens carefully with a microfiber cloth and repositioned it, hoping that what he was seeing was merely a trick of light or a flaw in the photographic process. But as he looked again, the evidence became even clearer. There, barely visible beneath the high collar, but unmistakable under proper examination, were what appeared to be dark marks, following a pattern that made his stomach clench with recognition. Marcus had examined thousands of vintage photographs throughout his career, and he had developed an expert eye for distinguishing between natural deterioration, chemical staining, and deliberate alterations. These marks were different from anything he had encountered before. They seemed to be part of the original image, captured by the camera at the moment the photograph was taken. The implications of what he was seeing began to dawn on him with growing horror. He reached for his high-resolution digital camera, equipped with specialized macro lenses designed specifically for detailed archival work. As he photographed the image at maximum magnification, each click of the shutter revealed more disturbing details that transformed his understanding of what he was examining. The woman's smile, which he had initially interpreted as the forced pleasantness expected in formal portraits, now seemed desperate, almost pleading. Her eyes, previously read as merely serious, appeared hollow and frightened, carrying a weight of suffering that spoke across more than a century. The husband's hand on her shoulder, which had seemed like a typical Victorian pose demonstrating marital authority, now felt ominous and controlling. Marcus noticed how tightly the man's fingers gripped her shoulder, the way his thumb pressed into her collarbone with what appeared to be deliberate force. Unable to shake the disturbing implications of what he had discovered, Marcus decided to research the photograph's origin with a thoroughness that had made him one of Chicago's most respected historical researchers. The estate donation paperwork indicated the photograph came from the belongings of Eleanor Hayes, an elderly woman who had recently passed away at the age of 93 in suburban Evanston. According to the documentation, the photograph had been found among her grandmother's possessions, stored in a cedar chest in a dusty attic where it had remained undisturbed for decades. The next morning, Marcus contacted the estate executor, a meticulous lawyer named Robert Chen, who maintained offices in downtown Chicago's financial district. They arranged to meet in Robert's wood-paneled office, where tall windows overlooked the bustling streets where horse-drawn carriages had once traveled during the era of the mysterious photograph. Robert proved to be a methodical man who had maintained detailed records of Eleanor Hayes's possessions, and her frequent conversations about family history during her final years. Mrs. Hayes was quite specific. About that particular box of photographs, Robert explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he consulted his notes. She mentioned it several times during our meetings about her estate planning. She said there were family secrets contained within those images that should probably stay buried, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy them. She seemed to believe that someone, someday, might need to know the truth about what happened to her ancestors. Marcus felt his pulse quicken at this revelation. Did she ever mention this specific photograph, or the people in it? Robert studied the image carefully, holding it up to the window to examine it in natural light. She did speak about her great-grandmother, Catherine, who died tragically young under what Eleanor called mysterious circumstances. Mrs. Hayes was always vague about the details, but she seemed to carry a burden of knowledge about Catherine's fate that troubled her greatly, especially in her final months. Catherine, is that the woman in the photograph? I believe so, yes. Eleanor mentioned that Catherine had married into one of Chicago's prominent families during the early 1900s, the Whitmore clan, if I remember correctly. They were quite wealthy, owned several textile mills, and had significant real estate holdings throughout the North Side. Robert paused, retrieving a thick folder from his filing cabinet. Eleanor was obsessed with genealogy during her later years, constantly researching her family tree and collecting documents. She left behind quite a collection of family records and correspondence. 2 days later, Marcus found himself standing in the doorway of Eleanor Hayes' former home, a modest but well-maintained bungalow in Evanston that smelled of lavender and old wood. The house had been emptied of most personal belongings, but the items deemed historically significant remained, waiting for Marcus's expert evaluation. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny witnesses to the secrets the house had kept for nearly a century. In the attic, surrounded by the accumulated memories of multiple generations, Marcus and his research assistant Jenny carefully examined the wooden chest that had contained the mysterious photograph. The chest itself was beautifully crafted from what appeared to be walnut, with brass fittings that had tarnished with age, but still bore intricate engravings of flowers and vines. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, they found not only additional photographs, but also personal documents that would prove crucial to understanding Catherine's story. Professor Thompson, look at this, Jenny said, her voice filled with excitement and trepidation as she held up a small leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages had yellowed to the color of old parchment. The leather binding, though cracked with age, had protected the contents from the ravages of time, preserving what would prove to be a devastating first-hand account of Catherine's experiences. Marcus opened the journal with the reverence due to such a significant historical artifact, recognizing immediately that it was written in a woman's careful handwriting. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained clearly legible. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1901, exactly the same year as the photograph that had started this investigation. My dearest diary, the entry began in flowing script. I pray that someday someone will understand what happened to me, should anything occur to prevent me from telling this story myself. As Marcus read further, the entries painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Catherine's marriage to Thomas Whitmore. The early entries spoke of loneliness and isolation, describing a woman trapped in a gilded cage of social expectations and economic dependence. But as the months progressed through 1901, the entries described incidents that made Marcus's hands shake as he turned the pages. Thomas's temper grows worse with each passing day. One entry read, "The children have learned to make themselves invisible when he raises his voice, and I find myself wearing higher collars and longer sleeves to cover the evidence of his displeasure with me." The journal revealed a pattern of escalating violence that had been carefully hidden from Chicago society, where the Whitmore name commanded respect, and Thomas's public persona was that of a charitable businessman and devoted family man. Marcus stared at the journal entry, then looked back at the photograph with completely new understanding flooding through him like a revelation. The family portrait, which they now knew had been taken in early 1901 when Catherine's situation was already deteriorating, wasn't just a formal family photograph documenting a moment in time, it was evidence. Catherine had been documenting her suffering in the only way available to her, hoping that someday someone would look closely enough to see past the carefully constructed facade and recognize the truth she was trying to preserve. She knew, Marcus said quietly to Jenny, his voice filled with admiration for Catherine's courage and horror at her situation. She knew when she sat for this portrait that she was leaving a record. The high collar wasn't just following fashion, it was absolute necessity to hide what Thomas was doing to her. But she positioned herself so that careful examination would reveal the evidence. Using his most sophisticated digital equipment, Marcus created extremely high-resolution images of the photograph, enlarging specific sections until individual grain structures and the photographic emulsion became visible. With Catherine's journal providing context for what they were seeing, the evidence became startlingly clear. The marks on Catherine's neck were entirely consistent with manual strangulation attempts. Not necessarily fatal attacks, but repeated incidents of violence that had left lasting physical evidence on her skin. "Look at the way she's positioned in that chair," Jenny observed, studying the enlarged images on Marcus's computer screen. "She's sitting very rigidly, almost as if she's in physical pain or trying to hold herself in a way that minimizes discomfort. And see how her hands are clasped so tightly in her lap? That's not a relaxed pose. That's someone trying to maintain control under extreme stress." Marcus nodded grimly, pointing to other details that now took on sinister significance. "And look at Thomas's grip on her shoulder again. Now that we understand the context, it doesn't look protective or affectionate. It looks controlling, possessive, almost threatening. Notice how his fingers are positioned, pressing into her shoulder and collarbone area with what appears to be deliberate pressure." They continued reading Catherine's journal chronologically, piecing together a timeline of escalating violence that painted Thomas Whitmore as a man who used his social position and economic power to systematically terrorize his wife while maintaining his reputation as a pillar of Chicago society. The journal entries revealed a woman of remarkable intelligence and courage, someone who understood that she needed to create a record of what was happening to her. Even though she lived in an era when such accusations against a prominent man would likely be dismissed or blamed on the victim herself, Marcus's investigation led him deeper into Chicago's historical records, where he spent days in the basement archives of the Chicago Public Library. Surrounded by bound volumes of newspapers and city documents that smelled of aging paper and forgotten stories, what he discovered painted a disturbing picture of a community that either genuinely didn't know what was happening to Catherine Whitmore or had collectively chosen to look the other way, blinded by Thomas Whitmore's wealth, social position, and carefully cultivated public image. "Look at this obituary." Marcus showed Jenny a microfilm printout from the Chicago Tribune dated September 12, 1903. The death notice, published prominently due to the Whitmore family's social standing, described Catherine as a devoted wife and mother of exemplary character who succumbed to a sudden and unexpected illness, leaving behind a loving husband and 2 young children to mourn her untimely passing. The language was typical of the era's euphemistic approach to death, but there was no mention of any suspicious circumstances, no hint that Catherine's death might have been anything other than a tragic natural occurrence. "But here's what makes this even more troubling," Jenny said, pulling up another newspaper clipping from 6 months later. Thomas Whitmore remarried within half a year of Catherine's death, and to his 22-year-old secretary no less. Even for that era, when widowers often remarried quickly for practical reasons, this was considered scandalously fast. Several society columnists made pointed comments about the unseemly haste of the union. Marcus found additional records showing that Thomas's second marriage had been celebrated with great fanfare, described in the society pages as a joyous celebration of new beginnings for one of Chicago's most prominent families. The wedding announcement included glowing descriptions of Thomas as a devoted father eager to provide his children with maternal care, and his new bride as a virtuous young woman ready to embrace the responsibilities of motherhood and society. Leadership. He had already moved on, emotionally and practically, before Catherine. Was even cold in her grave, Marcus said with disgust. This level of planning suggests that her death wasn't unexpected, at least not by him. He may have been actively planning his future while she was still alive and suffering. Their research revealed that Catherine's death had occurred during a period when domestic violence was rarely acknowledged, publicly, and was universally considered a private family matter that should never be discussed outside the home. Women had virtually no legal recourse against abusive husbands, and society often blamed them for somehow provoking their husbands' violent behavior. The concept of marital rape didn't exist legally, and physical discipline of wives was still considered acceptable by many as long as it didn't result in death or permanent disfigurement. Marcus's search for information about Catherine's children, Emma and James Whitmore, led him to the Cook County Historical Society, where dusty records revealed a heartbreaking pattern that confirmed Catherine's worst fears about her family's future. The records showed that both children had been permanently separated, not only from their deceased mother, but also from each other, sent to live with different relatives scattered across the Midwest within months of their father's remarriage. Emma, who had been 10 years old when her mother died, had been sent to live with Catherine's younger sister in Milwaukee, while 8-year-old James had been placed with Thomas's brother's family in Detroit. The separation of siblings was a common practice when parents died or couldn't care for their children, but it was highly unusual for a wealthy father to relinquish custody of his children so quickly after remarrying, especially when his new wife was young and presumably capable of caring for them. The records suggest that Thomas wanted the children out of his household as soon as possible, explained Margaret. the Historical Society's genealogy specialist, as she pulled additional files from the archives. But this was particularly cruel because it meant the children lost not only their mother, but also each other and any connection to familiar surroundings during their most vulnerable time. Through painstaking genealogy work that involved tracing marriage records, census data, and city directories across multiple states, Marcus was able to follow Emma's life path and made an extraordinary discovery. She had lived to be 91 years old, dying in Milwaukee in 1984. Even more importantly for his investigation, he found that Emma had participated in an oral history project with the Milwaukee Historical Society in the late 1970s, when she was in her 80s and still possessed clear memories of her childhood in Chicago. She specifically asked to be interviewed about domestic violence in the early 1900s, Margaret explained as she retrieved the archived tape recording from climate-controlled storage. I remember this interview particularly well because it was one of the most disturbing and detailed testimonies we've ever recorded about family violence during that era. Emma was very articulate and seemed driven by a need to ensure that her mother's story was finally told truthfully. As Marcus listened to the crackling recording of Emma's elderly but still strong voice, the full horror of Catherine's situation became crystal clear. Emma spoke with the precision of someone who had spent decades thinking about these events, describing specific incidents of violence that corresponded perfectly with entries in Catherine's journal. Her testimony provided the missing piece of the puzzle, the us perspective of a child witness who had grown old carrying the weight of terrible secrets, the oral history. Recording provided Marcus with information that led to what would become his most significant archaeological discovery. Emma's recorded testimony mentioned that her mother had hidden important documents somewhere in their Chicago home before her death, papers that Catherine had desperately wanted preserved as evidence, but had been too terrified to reveal during her lifetime. Knowing that discovery would likely result in even more severe punishment from Thomas, Mama was always writing, Emma's voice crackled through the old speakers. She would hide her diary and other papers behind a loose brick in the cellar wall. She made me promise never to tell Papa about her secret hiding place. And she said that someday, when we were grown up, James and I should come back and get those papers so people would know the truth about what happened to her. Emma's testimony revealed that after Catherine's death, Thomas had torn through the house like a man possessed, searching frantically for something he never found. He was looking for Mama's writings, Emma explained. He seemed to know that she had been keeping records of what he did to her, and he was desperate to find them and destroy them, but Mama had been too clever. She had hidden them too well. Marcus realized he needed to locate the original Whitmore house, if it still existed after more than a century of Chicago's urban development. City records showed that the family had lived at 1247 Maple Street on Chicago's north side, in what had been an affluent neighborhood during the early 1900s. When Marcus and Jenny drove through the area, they were amazed to discover that the original Victorian house was not only still standing, but remarkably well preserved, though it had been converted into rental apartments sometime during the 1960s. The current owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a retired teacher who had purchased the building as an investment property and had always been curious about its history. She was fascinated by the historical significance of Marcus's research and immediately gave him permission to examine the basement, even offering to help with the search. "You know, that's funny you should mention hidden papers," she said as she led them down the creaking basement stairs. "The previous owners mentioned finding some old documents behind some loose bricks down here when they were doing renovation work in the 1980s. They left everything in a metal box because they didn't know what to do with historical papers." In the musty basement, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, Marcus found a small corroded metal box wedged behind several loose bricks in exactly the location Emma had described. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay, were documents that Catherine had hidden over a century earlier, waiting for someone to discover her truth. The contents of Catherine's hidden cache were more extensive and damning than Marcus had dared hope. Along with additional diary entries that hadn't been in the journal upstairs, there were letters Catherine had written to her sister in Milwaukee but had never been able to send, each one describing Thomas's escalating violence in heartbreaking detail. She had also somehow managed to obtain or create photographs of her injuries, evidence that she had been systematically collecting in case she ever found the courage or opportunity to seek help from authorities or family members. She was building a comprehensive case against him, Jenny said in amazement as they carefully examined the documents by the light of Marcus's professional photography lamps. She documented dates, times, witnesses, specific injuries, everything she would need to prove a pattern of abuse. She was thinking like a lawyer or a detective, trying to create an unshakable record of what was happening to her. The most damning piece of evidence was a letter Catherine had written to the Chicago Police Department but had never been able to deliver, dated just 3 weeks before her death in 1903. In it, she detailed specific incidents of violence, provided names of servants who might have witnessed Thomas's behavior, and explicitly stated her fear that he was planning to kill her. "I believe my husband intends to end my life," she had written in her careful script. I am hiding this letter in hopes that if something happens to me, it will serve as evidence that my death was not natural or accidental. Armed with Catherine's journal, the hidden documents, Emma's oral history, and the photographic evidence, Marcus now possessed a complete picture of what had happened to Catherine Whitmore. The 1901 family portrait wasn't just a photograph, it was a silent scream for help. A desperate woman's attempt to leave evidence of her suffering for future generations to discover and understand. Marcus contacted Detective Patricia Walsh from the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit, who specialized in historical crimes and pattern analysis. Detective Walsh was intrigued by the comprehensive nature of Marcus's evidence and the way it illuminated patterns of domestic violence that remained tragically consistent across more than a century. While we obviously can't prosecute Thomas Whitmore for crimes committed in 1903, this kind of historical documentation helps us understand the continuity of domestic violence patterns and the ways victims have always tried to protect themselves and seek justice. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office reviewed Catherine's death records in light of the new evidence and concluded that her described symptoms and sudden death were entirely consistent with a long-term health, effects of sustained physical and psychological abuse. The sudden illness that officially killed Catherine Whitmore was almost certainly the result of chronic trauma, the examiner stated in his report. Her body simply couldn't survive the sustained stress of repeated violence and the fear of living under constant threat. Marcus's discovery of Catherine and Whitmore's story created ripples throughout Chicago's historical, academic, and social justice communities that extended far beyond what he had initially imagined. The Chicago Historical Society, recognizing the profound importance of Catherine's testimony and its relevance to contemporary issues, organized a major exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Domestic Violence Through American History, featuring Catherine's photograph and story as the emotional and educational centerpiece. The exhibition, which ran for 6 months and drew visitors from across the Midwest, presented Catherine's evidence alongside historical context about women's legal rights, social expectations, and the ways domestic violence had been systematically ignored or minimized throughout American history. The centerpiece was the 1901 family photograph, displayed alongside high-resolution enlargements that clearly showed the evidence Catherine had tried to preserve, accompanied by excerpts from her journal and letters that gave voice to her silent suffering. The response from visitors was overwhelming and deeply moving. Thousands of people stood before Catherine's portrait, many in tears as they read her words and understood the courage it had taken for her to document her abuse in an era when women had no legal recourse, and society blamed them for their husbands' violence. Several modern domestic violence survivors contacted the museum to share their own stories, inspired by Catherine's determination to leave evidence of what had happened to her. Catherine's story reminds us that domestic violence isn't a modern phenomenon that developed alongside contemporary social problems, explained Dr. Lisa Warren, a social historian from Northwestern University who collaborated with Marcus on the exhibition. Women throughout history have found ways to speak truth to power and protect future generations, even when society refused to listen to them or acknowledge their suffering. Emma's surviving descendants, contacted through Marcus's genealogy research, traveled from Milwaukee and other cities to see the exhibition and finally understand their family history. Catherine's great-great-granddaughter Susan was particularly moved by the discovery. I always wondered why our family never talked about our Chicago relatives, or why there seemed to be some kind of shame or secret surrounding that part of our history, she said. Now I understand that great-great-grandmother Catherine was a hero who risked everything to ensure that future generations would know the truth about what happened to her. The 1901 family photograph now hangs permanently in the Chicago Historical Society's main gallery, accompanied by a comprehensive placard explaining its significance as both a historical artifact and a testament to human resilience. Marcus published his findings in multiple academic journals, contributing to a growing body of scholarly work that examines domestic violence through historical artifacts and personal testimonies. Catherine Whitmore's story has become a powerful reminder that the most ordinary-looking evidence can reveal extraordinary truths about human courage, and that the past continues to speak to those willing to listen carefully to its whispered secrets.